Hello, I'm Nathan Carlin. This is Life and Work. Life and Work is a series where we talk to scholars and intellectuals about the connections between their public scholarship and their personal lives. Life and Work is supported by the McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics. We're here today with Dr. Tess Jones. She's the editor of the Journal of Medical Humanities. She's also the director of the Arts in Humanities and Healthcare program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Dr. Jones, how did you get interested in the field of medical humanities and health humanities in the first place?
Well, I didn't expect to be interested at all because I didn't know what it was. I'd never heard of medical humanities when I was doing my doctoral work in English at the University of Colorado Boulder. And my fields of study were American literature, modern and contemporary American drama, and gender. And this was through the 1980s. I finished in my degree in 1990, and towards the middle or the end of the 1980s, I began to take note of how the arts and the humanities were responding to a new epidemic. And that epidemic was AIDS. And it was a medical mystery. Medical science did not know what caused it. Medical science did not know how to treat it. People were becoming infected with an unknown agent, and people were dying, and they were young people dying. And what I began to see, and especially because I was interested in the theater, was I began to see the arts coming in and being as important in terms of our understanding what was happening as biomedical sciences. And what we began to see in the arts was this proliferation of cultural materials, plays and memoirs and poetry and dance and music that just came pouring out. And much of it was devoted to educating the public about what was happening, but also about the people who were being impacted by this new, unknown, and terrifying disease. And it just really caught my attention because what I saw the humanities and the arts making an immediate and real difference in something going on. And so once I'd finished my dissertation and I was looking about for a job, I began to more or less immerse myself in the cultural representations of AIDS. In 1994, I produced a book, Sharing the Delirium, Second Generation AIDS Plays and Performances, and I ran into a psychiatrist who said to me, "You know what you're doing is medical humanities," and I'm like, "What is that?" And I applied for the one and only postdoc in the field, and I took myself off to spend 3 years in a medical school to learn not only about medical humanities, but also about the field of medical ethics and bioethics.
Yeah,
I had never heard of that.
That's interesting. And there couldn't have been that many postdocs in medical humanities in those days. I could see there being a number of ethics positions, but this one was dedicated to the humanities.
This was dedicated to the humanities, and it was at a very particular place. It was at the time, it's now called Northeast Ohio Medical University, but it was a 6-year BS MD program. And because it was a medical school that was structured that way, they had developed a very intensive, very rigorous, and very sophisticated humanities program there called Human Values in Medicine. And it was both ethics as well as humanities because these students were coming in 2 years for a BS. So they didn't have the luxury or the option of even studying the humanities. So where do you bring it in? And so they actually were developing the field.
Interesting.
From the 70s throughout the 80s. And I just happened along, I saw this postdoc opportunity and I took it, and I have been in health professions education ever since then.
That's amazing. That one decision set the direction for the rest of your career.
It did, and
Yeah.
it's been interesting too because, it's an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary field, and which to me has been incredibly exciting. And it's given me the opportunity to be as creative and I hope as relevant as I can be. But at some point, and I think a lot of my colleagues have had a similar moment in which you recognize, oh, I don't think I could go back to an English department now because we are interdisciplinary scholars and educators. We haven't really focused on a particular literary period or a particular literary genre. And so, by virtue of just what we do and where we do it, we don't fit in those disciplinary silos anymore.
Interesting. Yeah. And so you went and did this postdoc. You had a personal sort of interest in this material because you see HIV/AIDS affecting the culture in a new way. You had this dissertation interest in theater, and you then say there's all kinds of modern contemporary arts being produced in response to an epidemic right here, right now. You see the relevance of the humanities, the difference that it can make, and so that sort of inspires you to do a postdoc kind of related to this material because somebody at a conference, a psychiatrist, says to you, what you're doing is medical humanities. You say, what is that? You go and you do it. So then what happens?
Well, that's a really good question. And I
Yeah.
had the opportunity, not only to learn about the field
Yeah.
as it was emerging,
Mm-hmm.
but also, I realized that in the work that was being done in the medical humanities and the work that I might be able to do in the medical humanities, there was relevance there. I realized that teaching literature in a sort of in an ivory tower was something I thought I wanted, but I really wanted what I was doing with students to have some immediacy. I wanted it to have some timeliness and some relevance. And I think that by moving into an applied discipline, it gave me that opportunity. So after the postdoc, I took my first faculty position, and it was back at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center. So I spent several years in the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and which was still probably, I won't say in its infancy, but it was more or less in its toddlerhood there at the university. And I had an opportunity to do a couple of things. One is I had to really, begin to think more deeply about the kind of teaching I wanted to do, about the kind of teaching I could do, because finding opportunities to teach literature, film, and the visual arts in a packed curriculum in medical education is a challenge. And it has a lot of political elements to it, as well as a lot of pedagogical challenges to it. And I learned about, I learned at the time about integration, how important integration is.
In the curriculum?
In the curriculum, and, bringing the humanities into a medical school curriculum in a very timely and thoughtful way. But I also learned about, I learned more about bioethics because we did have a required ethics course then. And I really began to think and spend more time bringing humanities materials, and especially stories, into the work I was doing with my bioethics colleagues. I was approaching their cases as literary texts.
Wow.
And they began to, it took a little convincing, but I think they finally recognized that, well, wait a minute. A bioethics case is as much a constructed text as any film or any short story or any poem. And we began to actually include more imaginative works in the required ethics curriculum, including things like an illness narrative, having students actually read and then write their own illness narratives.
Mhm.
And that made a real difference.
Yeah. With a short ethics case that you might have, like say, a married man has HIV and he says to the doctor, "You can't tell my wife because this will destroy my marriage." This is a case that's in Bernie Lowe's clinical ethics book. What do you see as the limitations of a ethics case like that as a constructed sort of genre? I assume it has there's certain things that it can accomplish, but there may be certain limitations that you saw that you said, well, wait a minute, let's read a pathography. A pathography does something different.
Yeah.
And what is that?
Well, I think it complicates it, first of all,
Complicates
because
it.
as it appears on the text, and I've seen that case, as
Yeah.
it appears there, we have so little information. All we get to this sort of moral and ethical and actually even legal conflict, and we start grappling with that without the questions we need to ask or the information that we don't have. For instance, the race, ethnicity, the age of this individual, how long this individual has been married to a particular woman, what this individual's sexual history or sexual past history has been, this individual's religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs, how are there children, what are all of the elements that would bring this person to that place to say, please don't tell my wife.
Oh, it says something about the marriage and the relationship.
Absolutely.
As well. Yeah.
It says something about how this person identifies, does this person, is this an African American male, or perhaps his ethnicity is Latino. He's in a culture in which, identifying oneself as bisexual or gay is problematic in many, many instances, but especially, we know in communities such as these. It may have to do with where we were in the whole history of HIV/AIDS. I mean, is this a contemporary case?
Yeah, if it's 1984 versus 2004.
In 84, it seemed like a death sentence.
Yeah.
But if we are now in 2018, we approach it as a chronic illness that can be quote unquote managed. It's not to say that, there's not a lot of challenges there. But it's a disease that is still stigmatized, in spite of the fact that we have, successful treatments. So I think that by opening it up, by, thickening it, by beginning to ask questions, to talk about who this person is, what we know about the marriage, what we know about the relationship, what we know about this person's community, where this person works. Would he lose his job? Would he lose his health insurance?
Interesting.
So those would be questions I have. And by bringing in a story, of what that moment of diagnosis is like for some individuals and what that means when they have to disclose.
Yeah.
Both to partners as well as family members. Especially with the stigmatized disease, I think that that complicates it in a way.
That's interesting. Like the moment of diagnosis. That's interesting because it seems so obviously moral, not in a sort of decision making way. Like there's no, it seems like it has something to do with, I don't know, his existential experience, sense of right and wrong, and like in a grand sense about just, I don't know, his experience of the universe or something like that. I guess I can imagine all of that, and that little case, just a sentence or two long. I get. I don't know. This conversation helps me see the limits of that.
Yeah, and we're even assuming that maybe he was infected, that it was sexual transmission. He might have been an injection drug user before he married his wife, but she has no idea of that past. And what does that mean in terms of how one understands, one's life experience and where they are now? So there are many, many ways that we could really come at that. And this may be a little tangential, but about 2 weeks ago, I brought a panel of people in to one of our arts and medicine lectures, and it was December 3rd, so it was close to World AIDS Day, which is now 30 years old.
Wow.
There were 3 individuals, and they've all been living with HIV, and one of them was a young woman. She's now an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and she came to Boulder from Indonesia to go to graduate school. So this has been, let's say maybe within the last 7 or 8 years. And because she had health care, access to health care for the first time, she went and had what she thought would be a well woman's checkup. And there were some red flags. And she was tested for HIV, and she tested positive. She had one sex partner in her life.
Amazing.
And it was her boyfriend in Indonesia. And so she came back from the clinic, and she called him. And she told him what happened. And she was, of course, emotional. And he said he was really sorry. And when she tried to call him back, he never took another phone call from her.
Amazing.
And so she had to, just within the last 7 or 8 years, she had to learn how to negotiate this and how to understand what she would do. She was a PhD student in anthropology, and she decided to focus her dissertation and her work on HIV stigma.
Wow.
So it changed her work. But as I listened to her, I was really mindful of all of the complications of what that meant. That moment of diagnosis was transformative for her, in her life. And then the person who, it's sort of the flip side to that sterile little ethics case.
Right.
What does happen? What would have happened if he didn't tell his wife?
Right.
What would have happened to her?
But this is the flip side, and it's a real case.
It's a real story.
And I have to assume that she felt incredibly betrayed.
She did, and she was alone in Boulder, Colorado, from Indonesia. She had no family. She had a friend who lived on the East Coast, and she reached out to her, and completely feeling ashamed because this had happened to her. But she found information, and she found support, and she's doing well, and she finished her dissertation, and now she's an assistant professor up there, and and speaks out and tells her story. And to hear that story, while it's different, it's different than the ethics case on the page. It just is so, it reminds us of how complicated human beings are and our relationships. And what people do or don't do around stigmatized diseases or around health challenges in terms of a relationship, or shame around sexuality or sexual behavior, all of those things, and I just don't feel like that case is just the starting point for a conversation. I don't see it as a way we can begin to unpack it and make and come to some kind of consensus with the little information we have.
I like that's not it's not a conclusion, it's an introduction.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so part of what you're doing, or what I hear you saying, is part of what the humanities do for medicine and medical education, health professionals, is it helps us to thicken experience, to understand things sort of in deep ways, understand different angles, give us different points of view.
Yeah, we complicate things.
Complicate things, yeah.
We do.
Yeah.
We really do complicate things. I think the other thing that we do, and we say this, and I think our colleagues in bioethics and medical ethics say the same thing, is that we compel our colleagues in medicine, our students, as well as ourselves, to sit with ambiguity. Because, we can take a literary text, or we can look at a painting, or we can watch a film together and, spend time talking about the structural elements of it, the plot, the characterization, some of the new, some of the elements that go together to make up that work, that work of imagination. But what we find as we're having that conversation is that we're all bringing something that we haven't seen. Someone is bringing something that we haven't noticed, or as soon as you say, well, I thought this, I may see something in an entirely different way. My interpretive stance may change radically. And I like the democratic small d process of making meaning together, because with a work of art, because I think it mirrors what happens in medicine. That whole process of clinical reasoning, the whole process of people bringing different pieces of information together to come up with some interpretation, whether it's a diagnosis or a differential diagnosis, whatever is happening, and to try to understand what's going on with this patient.
That, and sort of reasonably complicated medical cases, it's a team sort of interpreting
Absolutely.
this, and so in that sense it already is kind of a democratic process. But what I hear you saying is the humanities can even broaden that even further, because maybe medicine itself tends to, I don't know, privilege a certain sort of point of view.
Yeah. Well, it's hierarchical, and that's what I like about bringing people into an art gallery, because it can be attendings, it can be students, it can be staff members. We're all there to make meaning together, and nobody's got the right answer.
Sure.
You may have the most persuasive interpretation.
Yeah.
Of a text or of a painting.
Yeah.
And I say, okay, yeah, I can see that, and I think we'll go with that. But you don't have the right answer. And it really does take you out of this whole kind of hierarchy and level the sort of, interpretive, the field of interpretation.
Sure. Yes, it doesn't, like, I could see with a piece of art or a piece of fiction or something like that, there's better interpretations and worse interpretations, and but as long as something's on the playing field, like it makes sense to hear every voice.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because somebody may notice something that you didn't notice at all, or you may just assume that the figure you're seeing is female. And the person across the room may say, well, no, I see that figure as male. Or I don't know if this figure is, male, female, or I have no idea what may be the gender identity of this figure. And that begins to change the conversation. You were like, oh, wait a minute, why did I think that was a woman? What are my assumptions here? Why am I looking at in this particular way? Well, you can run through the list and figure out, okay, my point of view is a biased point of view, because I'm looking at this out of the lenses of my own gender, race, socioeconomic level, academic training,
Sure.
Experience in other art museums, all of those things.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're also very well known for the term health humanities. You're probably the leader of the movement in the United States, anyway. Um, and my understanding is that, or could you talk about the difference between medical humanities and health humanities? My sense is that it has something to do with this critique that you're just talking about
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
I think so. Okay, so and the real quick history lesson here.
Mm-hmm.
So medical humanities really developed almost in parallel with bioethics in the 1970s. So those big questions that were being raised because of technology in the 70s about when does life begin, when does life end, that this new field of bioethics began to grapple with, things like organ transplants. About the same time, there was this, I won't say parallel movement, but certainly, maybe in tandem movement of a concern about the humanistic practices or the sort of or the humanities in medical education. In Kenneth Ludmer's kind of major book about how medical education changed, he very succinctly, he said, it was as if the medical student was lost as medical education was developing in the 1970s for many, many reasons. And the focus was much more on technology, and then we saw this. And so there was this sort of concerted effort by individuals in medicine and outside of medicine that began to see that bringing the humanities in as a corrective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To technology.
To technology,
Yeah.
and to the over focus on technology.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't a bad thing, but it has also been a sort of a challenging thing, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the notion was that bringing the humanities into medical education and into clinical practice in a thoughtful way by experts, that this would in some way work to deepen the conversations about human experience, that it wasn't just focused on the technological. And so the very first English professor was hired at Hershey Medical School, and the very first, theologian was hired, and this began to develop in very small numbers, but it was consistent. And over the course of the 70s and 80s, I think, medical humanities was developing. We had historians of medicine taking jobs in medical schools. We had literature, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Literature in medicine became a real, almost a singular focus in terms of medical humanities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why is that? Why do you think literature has had this special kind of...
Well, I think it was because pretty much the early medical humanities scholars were from literature.
Yeah.
And it was the notion that there were a couple of things that we could gain from literature. There was and many people have talked about the notion of literature as kind of a moral practice.
Mm-hmm.
That by reading stories, we can learn how to live a good life. We can learn what the right thing to do is and how we care for one another. So that was definitely one way to do it. Another way, and early on, and narrative medicine has really developed from this premise, was that learning to read stories was actually could be translated into a clinical skill in learning to think with stories. When a patient tells you her story,
Mm-hmm.
you need the skills to listen carefully to that story and understand point of view,
Mm-hmm.
character,
Mm-hmm.
plot,
Mm-hmm.
causality, all of those things that literary scholars do, right?
Mm-hmm.
We take a text and we break it down. And so there's a kind of a clinical skill that goes with that. And then the third thing was the belief that using literature, teaching literature, would foster empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That by reading a story of someone who is very unlike you, but who was struggling and having, the experience of illness or disability, that we could begin to learn how to connect cognitively as well as emotionally with that individual.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a sort of an aesthetic model, there was this sort of moral model, and then there was the notion that literature would foster empathy. And this stayed in place for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
But always at the center of this was this sort of tension
Mm-hmm.
among the humanities people and the medical people and the medical educators, because we can't really prove, we do not have a lab test
Mm-hmm.
that shows that reading Shakespeare
Mm-hmm.
or Virginia Woolf
Mm-hmm.
is going to make you a better doctor.
Yeah. Should we even try to do those kinds
Well,
of assessments?
I think where we've come now
Yeah.
is to say, no, we shouldn't even try to do those assessments.
Yeah. I think I remember there was that. I think it was Raphael Campo who wrote a piece in JAMA, and he was very critical of that. I think it was called the medical humanities for lack of a better
lack
term.
of a better term.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
our colleague Ann Hudson Jones, who was one of the, and certainly the first generation of medical humanities scholars, she said something very succinct. She said, we all hope that this will make people more humane, but
But we don't know.
we know
Yeah.
a lot of people who, we it's only a hope, and
Yeah.
we can't hold medical humanities scholars and educators to that, to sort of that, non-existent lab test to see if there's a titer or something that you can check.
Do you know humanities professors who are immoral?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. Or certainly amoral.
Right. Yeah.
But so I think that there was always that tension, and I believe it's still there.
Yeah.
I still believe that, and I still believe that there is a hope, but some kind of belief that exposure to literature and the arts will have this effect, whether it's a corrective, whether it's some kind of deepening of understanding and empathy. I certainly hope that.
Yeah, and I would say I definitely hope that, and I would say that it's true as well. It's not like it happens all of the time, but if I just look at my own life and my own exposure to the humanities, it fundamentally changed me as who I am as a person. I mean, at one time I was a religious fundamentalist, then I studied religion critically, and I gave all of that up. So I know for a fact that I changed my mind on many, many issues.
Yeah.
And it made me a more open person, a more progressive person. So, I would want that in the life of my students, and
Sure.
that's what
It is, but Jeff Bishop, who's an MD, PhD, he coined the term the dose effect of the medical humanities, and it's a kind of a slippery slope for us.
Sure.
Because on the one hand, we can use in order to validate our existence within this community, but it can also backfire because there's no way
to measure it.
We can't measure it.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's always been that tension there. And I think what has happened is that, I mentioned at the outset of this conversation, moving into an applied discipline. I think one of the ways we've managed that is to, again, think of the humanities in a kind of an instrumental way by looking at skills and talking about critical thinking, talking about observation skills, communication skills, reflective writing, so and narrative competence. And I use these terms all the time because I know that I'm speaking, if not the language, I'm certainly connecting to the values of my colleagues in medical education who are MDs. They want to talk about skills. They want to know, how this translates. And so, but the field has changed. The field has changed, and it changed especially through, the late 90s and the early part of the 21st century, in which, really interdisciplinary work, things like disability studies, queer studies, women and gender studies, really began to complicate what we were doing. And so we began to, to do more theoretical work. I think we began to move out of a canon that was only doctor stories or stories written by doctors to, more topically related things like women's bodies.
Sure.
Or, a course on race and gender instead of just, reading stories about doctors or by doctors. And we really began to interrogate and kind of moving away from literary inquiry to more cultural studies, to really begin to use, humanities materials to interrogate the culture. And that includes the culture of medicine and the culture of healthcare.
And for you, that's what the term health humanities means. It's incorporating all of this, especially various strands of critical thought, to sort of interrogate medicine.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to, dare I say, I don't know if this is a word, de-privilege medicine. Because one of the things all of us begin to grapple with is that when we say medical humanities, we are essentially excluding a lot of other health professions.
Nursing, dentistry.
Exactly. Pharmacy, physical therapy, occupational therapy. I mean, it's like, just go down the list. So there was that. Not only are we privileging medicine, which already has a privileged place in the health professions anyway.
Yeah, and on TV, right? I don't know, are there any nursing shows?
There used to be, but it was like Nurse Jackie, and she was a drug addict.
Okay. No shows about dentistry, right?
Not that I can think of.
Yeah,
but I think so. There was that, and I think the other piece of that was the recognition that this isn't just about biomedicine. This really is about health and human experience. And there are many people we know, even including the people we encounter, who don't necessarily avail themselves of biomedicine. That they see health in a very different way. Not, that they don't necessarily access biomedicine, or actually maybe even counter biomedicine as a way of thinking about impairment or disability, as a way of thinking about mental health.
I see what you mean. You're saying the word medical often can have ableist assumptions.
Absolutely, it has ableist assumptions, but it also really doesn't have anything to do with. I know sounds contradictory, but it really doesn't have anything to do with what we consider to be health. That there are many people we know who think of health very differently, in opposition to biomedical interventions. And so that was another reason that health seemed, and I think ultimately, in a piece that Delise Ware and I wrote for Academic Medicine called The Almost Right Word, the move from medical to health humanities. And the title comes from a Mark Twain, because Mark Twain says it better than anybody. He says it better about everything than anybody does. But he says, he's talking about trying to it's that there's a danger in the almost right word. It's the difference between lightning and the lightning bug, and so we all agree that maybe health humanities is the almost right word, but what it does do is it makes our field more inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does, acknowledge not just our health professional colleagues, but all of our humanities colleagues who are doing work in and around health, in and around suffering, in and around disability. It really, really, really makes the field much more diverse and much more inclusive. And I think it also, again, begins to, it also reinforces this practice of interrogating biomedicine, of critiquing biomedicine. Now, I'm pretty careful about this because I'm the editor of the Journal of Medical Humanities, and we haven't changed the title. And I recognize that I have colleagues, unlike myself, who are in medical schools, who teach medical students, and whose colleagues are primarily physicians. And I think that is, and sometimes I say medical/health humanities, but I'm mindful of that because their academic life, their academic work, and their academic identity is really about medical humanities because that's what they're doing.
Sure, yeah.
And so I don't dismiss that. I don't disparage that. I don't even see it actually even in conflict with health humanities.
No, I don't really see why.
I almost see it as a kind of a locale descriptor. It's kind of a local descriptor of where you are and what work you do. But I'm at a health sciences center, and I teach students across the entire academic landscape. And I just don't feel like my pharmacy students, I could call it medical humanities, but would I call it pharmacy humanities if they're in a class with me? I don't think so.
Sure.
So I think health humanities really does open it up.
What's the almost? What's the reservation about the term?
I think because health is such a loaded term.
That it's normative?
It's normative. Yeah. It's constantly contested.
Yeah.
I think...
what is health?
Yeah, and I think social scientists, they grapple with this notion of health all the time.
And who gets to define it?
And who gets to define it, and who owns the word. And I think that there's always that hesitation. We are humanities people, so we're trying to use language very carefully and thoughtfully.
Yeah.
So I think that that's probably why the almost right word. Healthcare humanities, I don't think works.
Yeah, it would exclude public health. Yeah.
It would exclude public health. Yeah. And so, people own that word health, and they sort of take possession of that word and they define it in relationship to their own professional standpoint. And so I think that that's part of the hesitation around that word. But I will say this, and Paul Crawford at the University of Nottingham is really, in terms of developing, I won't say developing, how about evolving the field from medical to health humanities? Paul Crawford was really the first person I know who used that term. And the difference with yes, it is academic inquiry there, but it's also moving the humanities and the arts into clinical practice. And they go in, I won't say in a different direction, but they go the next step and really bring arts practice into healthcare settings, the humanities into healthcare settings. And I'm not that kind of health humanities scholar and educator.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying, it's a slightly different emphasis for Dr. Crawford in the UK, more arts focused, more practice focused, and you're doing high scholarship.
We do, and I think most of my colleagues would agree with that. I think we spend a lot of time
and there's
critiquing,
critiquing,
analyzing,
yeah.
bringing materials to, to the seminar table to begin conversations and to ask questions
Mm-hmm.
and really to provide maybe entrances or opportunities, especially for our students, to again to begin to question um, biomedicine itself and the culture of healthcare itself. And I don't see that as problematic, and I'd love to see it as dangerous. I don't think we are but I think that's important. I think
Yeah.
it's important for our students to begin really to question some of what they're learning or some of what is happening to them as they move through this process, some of what they're seeing and how they're understanding it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to grapple with their own moral uneasiness around some of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, I think we provide that kind of safe place
Mm-hmm.
to have those wide-ranging conversations.
Mm-hmm. Where should the field go in the future?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I've thought a lot about that. I think I'm definitely seeing, one of the things I talked about in inclusiveness. I'm seeing expansiveness. I'm seeing expansion.
Hmm.
I'm seeing it in a couple of ways. I'm seeing expansion in terms of a much higher profile on the baccalaureate level.
Mm-hmm.
So I and my colleagues have been tracking the development of majors, minors, and concentrations in U.S. and Canadian undergraduate programs, and it's just the growth has been exponential. So I'm seeing expansion there, which is interesting because it's almost like, it was more or less coalesced in medical education and health professions education, but now it's really expanding into undergraduate education and even graduate education as an important field of inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I think we're getting much more sophisticated and more diverse theoretical perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Things like race studies,
Mm-hmm.
and really beginning to, deepen and develop the field theoretically.
Like incorporating critical race theory into sort of health
Absolutely,
humanities.
absolutely. And critical disability study,
Yeah,
critical disability studies is its own field, but it has had a major impact in the medical health humanities.
Yeah, it seems like such a natural fit.
It
there.
is,
Yeah.
and it's made a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that I'm seeing, and part of it is maybe because of the work that I do, but also maybe in connection with the values and the aspirations of the students I'm seeing, and that's the move of medical and health humanities. Not so much out of the academy, but really more towards a tool of social advocacy.
Mm.
And I mean, that's sort of where I started.
Yeah.
And so that feels very familiar to me. And that's why I said maybe I'm, seeing this because that's what I do, or I try to continue to do. But I do see it as an important step forward. I think it's more than just about empathy for the other now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's more about, yes, maybe fostering empathy, but also asking questions about action, about making difference, about making change. And I think our students, because of who they are and how they've grown up, I think they're motivated to do that.
Yeah.
I really do. And I think the humanities and the arts can serve that very well.
Yeah, that's interesting, that move from being empathetic to sort of being an advocate. Just sort of like, I could be empathetic with you and your suffering, but not do anything about it. So you're saying, like, take the next step and, change the conditions in which people find themselves suffering. Is that
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I just finished this course with pharmacy students called Film, Healthcare, and Advocacy, and I, leap of faith here. I typically, don't do things like this with students, and they had to, they were required to do a team media project.
Mhm.
And to provide 3 to 5 minutes, and it had to include video. And they had to identify an issue. And they had to present it and they had to present their work as a work of advocacy.
Mm.
And so I walked into this final session where they were going to do their media projects with, I'm going to say, no expectations. I had no idea how this was going to work. They had coaching from the digital storytelling people, and of course they'd been watching movies all semester, and we really did a lot of analysis on the film, and we talked about it. I was blown away by the work that these students did as teams. One of the first pieces was a short video about depression and being a health profession student.
Wow.
And it was a personal narrative. It was done with voiceover. And we saw this individual, and she talked about what was, some of what happened to her. And then they provided resources in the video itself. So it wasn't just, let me tell you the story. It was, let me show you what's available and what you can do if you are feeling this way. So, there was a project like that, and then there was a project on something that completely took me by surprise because I had never thought about that, on how to advocate for green pharmacies. Because pharmacies, 85% of what they throw away, they do not recycle, are not, biological materials or materials that are hazardous. They are paper and they are plastic, but they are not allowed to recycle them.
Interesting. I assume you learned this from a pharmacy student.
I learned this from they were called the Green Team.
Yeah.
That was their media project.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And it was amazing. And they made this, and they, after they finished, because our students are in retail pharmacy, that's what they do as their jobs as they're going through pharmacy school. And so the question was, well, what are you going to do now? And they said, well, this is on the corporate level. And I just looked at them and I said, no, you just created this advocacy video.
Yeah.
You need to now move this forward because they've got the material there.
Yeah.
It was kind of corny, but you are the change that you're envisioning here.
Yeah.
And it was like, we can do this. We can do this.
Yeah.
It's a simple change, but it was like, it was a major advocacy project for them. So it was amazing to see what they came up with, and I think it really helped them think about how to make change.
It's amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Jones. This has just been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed my time with you so much. I've learned so much from you. You're an inspiration to me and to all of our colleagues in the field. Thank you for leading this movement.
You are so welcome, and thank you, McGovern Center, because of the work you are doing. I have the utmost respect for you and for your colleague, Dr. Tom Cole. I mean, he has also been somebody who's been at the forefront of this field really early on, since its inception, and it's just a joy and an honor to be here.
Thank you.